This is Startup Playbook, an All Turtles podcast series about how startup founders and product teams tackle entrepreneurship's biggest challenges. I'm your host, Marie McCoy-Thompson. If you're hard at work, building a product with your team, and you've been in the trenches perfecting every part of the product, you might find that when you take a moment to look up from what you've been doing and look around you, that you notice just how many others out there are building similar things. Sometimes very similar things. And you have to come up with a strategy for how to deal with that competition. Maybe those competing companies have more resources than you, or more employees, or more brand recognition. And knowing how to outpace competition, or just how to deal with it in general, is a difficult yet essential part of entrepreneurship. To talk about how to do it well, Matt Schlicht is joining me today. Matt is the CEO of Octane AI, which is an automated AI messaging product that e-commerce companies can use to chat with their customers. Through building Octane AI, Matt has learned a great deal about the importance of focusing on a vertical. And I'm personally happy to report, as a media person myself, on the value of producing good content to help your brand stand out. Let's get into it. Hey, Matt, how's it going? Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to talk about competition.
So what exactly is Octane AI? If I had a small business and I wanted to implement it, what does that look like?
Basically, what Octane AI will do for an e-commerce brand is it is a automated AI-based sales assistant that can connect and chat with the customer, whether they're on the e-commerce website, or maybe they've left the website and they're on Facebook, or they're just walking around with their phone. And Octane AI tracks the entire customer journey. So if you have a Shopify store, for example, and you wanted to set up Octane AI, you basically just click a couple buttons.
So if I'm a customer who shops around online, where are some places where I might have interacted with an Octane AI chatbot?
Yeah, so we work with well over 1,000 e-commerce brands right now, and it's growing really quickly. So the chances that you've run into an Octane AI bot is definitely high, especially if you're shopping for clothes or accessories or sofas or anything like that. Some really notable brands that work with us that, even if you haven't heard of them, these are brands that are making millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, even $100+ million a year. Apartment2B.com, Bridgewater Candles, CoverFX, which is a makeup brand that's also featured in Sephora, GoPro. We also work with a bunch of celebrities who also have their own stores. Lots of different places that you could have run into us.
And you say that Octane has evolved. Can you talk about how it was like in the early days when you were starting out? In those early days, how did you define who your competitors were?
Yeah, so in the early days, the idea was pretty basic, right? It was just, okay, people are messaging each other a ton on messaging apps, and we need to build a platform maybe similar to what businesses are used to with email automation, but we need to build it for messaging automation, and it needs to be interactive. And at the time, messaging automation was really new. There were starting to be a couple other platforms that were popping up that were also very general and not focused on a vertical. And as we continue to test it, maybe throughout the first year, a lot of platforms started popping up who were starting to create these tech platforms where you could automate messaging. And basically what we saw is we really wanted to focus on a vertical and a use case where we knew that we were driving real ROI. And the reason we wanted to do this is, one, so that we could double down on the product to just help those customers who we knew we could provide an ROI for. And then the second thing was, now that we have all these different companies trying to do marketing automation over Messenger, we wanted to differentiate ourselves from them by focusing on a vertical. And so what we ended up finding was that the e-commerce brands that were using us were having a lot of success, and a lot more success than any other type of customer that we had. And when we dove into it, what we realized is that e-commerce, basically since the beginning of e-commerce, has been built on top of email. And so enabling those same brands who have built their business on top of email automation, enabling them to reach people on a new channel, which is growing really fast and is where people spend a lot more of their time than email, which is these messaging channels, was like a no-brainer. And so that's why they were seeing early success even before we'd kind of focused the Octane AI platform just on supporting those types of companies.
And how has your assessment of your competitors, how has that evolved over time?
Yeah, so I think in the beginning, we were kind of just looking at anybody that was generally in the space of messaging because it was not super defined on what the use cases were going to be, how it was going to work, what you exactly wanted your bot to do or what you wanted your automated messaging to do or how the customers were going to react to it. And so in the beginning, we definitely were looking at anybody and everybody that was trying to do anything because we needed to figure out at a kind of bird's eye view what was working and what wasn't working. What happened over time, I think like the first thing was like first we did the bird's eye view, and then the second thing we did was say, okay, look, everybody's trying to target this like general use case, which doesn't make any sense because you're never going to be the greatest thing for everybody. And so I think the first thing, that competition led us to do was focus on a specific vertical. And the reason for that and the kind of the thought behind that was if we focus on one specific vertical, we know that we can solve this problem and make the best solution for this vertical of customers. And anybody else, any of these competitors who ever tried to get these customers to use them instead of us, it would never work because these customers, these e-commerce brands, if they were to compare us, where we're completely focused on e-commerce versus anybody else who's not focused on e-commerce, the thought was that they should and would always go with us because we're going to be providing the best solution. And when we made that shift over to just focusing on e-commerce, that did start happening where any e-commerce brand that looked at us versus someone else, they would go with us because we were the best. Because we were focused on specifically what they were doing. After that, we did start to see other competitors who were in the e-commerce space specifically. And I think in the beginning, we were kind of paying attention a little bit to what they were doing. We're like, oh, are they copying us or like, are we building similar features? But what we decided was let's just not worry about what these other companies are doing, right? They're startups just like we are. Like there's a ton of, potential customers out there. There's so many e-commerce brands. We don't need to focus on the e-commerce brands that any of these like startup, competitors have. We just need to focus on making the best product there is so that we can stand out. So that if anybody ever looked at us compared to them, they would want to choose us. And I think that if we were to constantly just be looking at these other startups that were, a similar size to us, and that's kind of how we were looking at ourselves or making decisions, it would be very hard to ever become a lot better than them because they're almost like the ceiling of like inspiration or innovation. And so what we started to do was look at larger companies that, maybe they've already gone public. Maybe they already start to do, maybe they're doing stuff like email automation right now, but they haven't gotten into messaging automation yet. Maybe they're doing other channels, but they're not doing it on Messenger yet. Those are the sort of companies we started to look at and take inspiration from, even if they weren't specifically building the exact same product that we are today.
So it sounds like rather than focusing on fellow startups who are maybe in a similar space or trying to build similar products, you're looking more towards larger companies who perhaps have more resources to dedicate to the type of work that you're trying to do. Do you recommend that approach for all small startups? I mean, is it wise to be focused on companies that might outsize you, but perhaps are not as nimble in ways that they would be able to outpace you? Or do you think it depends on the type of space that you're in?
Yeah, I think for us, when we are, we're marketing automation is kind of like a category you would put us under. And we are a new type of marketing automation, but there's already really successful companies who have been around for a while. Like a Salesforce, for example, they're massive. And then you have other companies who are smaller than a Salesforce. Maybe they've raised like $100 to $300 million. They're a lot bigger than we are. But they're also under marketing automation. And so I think we're not really looking at the Salesforce type companies at the moment because they just have so many resources. They're just doing, they have like a million different types of products. It's not really possible for us to try to replicate their entire strategy. So it's not that useful for us to try to compare ourselves to them. Whereas maybe the companies, at our stage where they've raised like 100, 200, $300 million, like we're smaller than them at the moment, but they're not that much farther ahead. But they're but they are farther ahead than anyone that is like directly like horizontal to us. And so we look at them for the most inspiration. Like, how are they handling customer education? What do they do for onboarding? Like, what are some of the big reasons that people adopted their technology versus others? And we can take inspiration from that because it is something that maybe we can pick and choose one or two of the things they did, not try to copy everything. And we actually do have the ability to pretty rapidly implement that into what we're doing. And I think because we're looking at those companies as opposed to the ones that are like the startups that are maybe a little bit smaller, we're able to continue to differentiate ourselves from other companies that are smaller. And I think that that's probably relevant in no matter what space you're in, right? Like, you don't necessarily want to go do everything that Google's doing if you're just like a startup that raised a couple $1 million. But maybe there's a company out there that is similar in a similar space to what you're doing, or has a similar product, but not in the same vertical to you, that maybe they've raised a couple $100 million that you could take a lot of inspiration from. And you could use that to differentiate yourself from any of your competitors that your customers might be comparing you to.
So would you say that you're looking to these companies more as sources of inspiration rather than as potential threats to your success?
I think that there's two parts of this. I think one is in the area that we're in, where we're building, an automated sales assistant. It's a bot, it's on messaging channels, it's specifically for e-commerce. There isn't some massive company that does specifically that, right? But there are big companies that do email for e-commerce. They do carts or websites and transactions for e-commerce, other types of automation for e-commerce, and they are much bigger. And so I think on the one hand, we look at these types of companies because they're in a similar vertical to us, but not providing the same type of technology. We look to them for inspiration on what we can do to rapidly grow and reach customers and make our customers happy. And that's like one of the things we're doing. And then I think the second thing is, even if they're not competing with us right now, on a long enough timeline, it would make sense that they would start to build in some of the stuff that we have, or maybe they would try to build out a whole section of like a whole team that tries to do what we do. And so if we can take inspiration from how fast they grew, we can apply it to ourselves, then by the time anybody else tries to build this inside their team, it's not going to be anywhere near the capabilities that we have, and we could continue to kind of build out that moat around us.
You mentioned a little bit ago that there was a time when you were noticing other small, similarly sized startups entering the same space as you. Can you talk about what it felt like to start seeing those other startups? And you said maybe there was a feeling of, oh, maybe they are doing similar things, maybe even copying our features. What's going through your mind at that point, and how are you assessing that?
For us, I think it was a really great thing, actually, because it makes it easier for you to differentiate, right? If you're like the only one out there, you don't really have anything to compare yourself to. And I think what we've seen and what we're continuing to see is that these businesses really do need messaging solutions, and they really do need to automate it because they just don't have the number of humans that they would need to manually reach out to everybody. So it's like a very obvious thing that they would need this technology. And so the fact that a lot of people started trying to create these types of platforms, what ended up happening is that there were just a lot of mediocre platforms that came out. And for every mediocre platform there is, it makes us stand out more because we're trying to focus on quality, we're trying to focus on ROI, we're trying to focus on providing one use case with a really great solution. And so I think it was validating, but also it kind of paints us it provides contrast, I guess, for our potential customers. And I think that was a really good thing.
So it sounds like you sort of evolved from that moment into perhaps more along the lines of Phil's rock, paper, scissors model of dealing with competition. Did he ever talk to you about that philosophy that he has?
We have not talked about it, but I have watched his Rule of Three video about it.
I'm going to cut in here really quickly to include an audio clip from this Rule of Three video that we're talking about. Phil Libin is the CEO of All Turtles, and he recorded this video about the three-sided method of dealing with competition. Here's a clip.
I like to think of this as rock, paper, scissors, where startups are scissors, medium-sized, recently successful startups are rocks, and big companies are paper. And the threat model works the way that you expect. Scissors threaten paper, paper threatens rock, rock threatens scissors. What does this mean? Well, you're a scissor, you're a startup. Don't worry at all about what big companies are doing. They're too slow. You can dart in and out. You can cut away their customers. They can't react fast enough. In fact, if you're competing with a big company as a raw startup, don't worry about it. They're not your competitor. They're your target. Also, don't worry about what other startups are doing, other scissors. You're not competing with other startups because let's say you have 10 startups chasing the same thing. If all 10 of you suck, it doesn't matter who the best one is. You're all going to fail. And if 3 out of the 10 are pretty good, you'll all get to graduate, become medium-sized companies, and then fight it out. So don't worry about what other startups are doing. Focus on making your product as good as possible. But there is one category of companies that you should worry about as a startup, as a raw startup, which are the rocks, because they're still pretty fast. They haven't become big, stupid companies yet. Maybe they're not as fast as you, but they can still move quickly. And when they move with more force because they have customers, they have revenue, they have investors, they have partners. And so they can take your idea and implement it better. They can put more engineers on it. They can move more customers to it. So do worry about what recently successful startups are doing if they compete with you.
Okay, back to Matt's answer.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the way we look at it right now aligns with how he looks at it. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, just worrying more about medium-sized companies as your main competitors seems to make more sense with where you're at right now.
Yeah, because I think it's like it's achievable, right? Like I can pick out one thing a medium competitor does and our team can actually implement that and it can actually have a real impact. Whereas I'm not sure, like if you look at a company that was really, really, really massive, it's just the same rules don't really apply. Like we would need to be a medium level company and then looking at the biggest companies in the world and then maybe what they're doing, we could take inspiration from.
Were there competitors' moves that did influence the development of Octane? Like, were there specific points in Octane's growth where you actually altered course because of what a competitor was doing?
I wouldn't say that we altered course because of any like feature or any specific thing that a competitor was doing. I think for us, the big moment was a year after we started when we transitioned from being a general platform that wasn't focused on a specific use case to a e-commerce platform that was specifically focused on catering to e-commerce businesses. And I think it wasn't just one platform that made us make this decision. It was just that, there were literally 100 plus companies trying to make, generalized bot and messaging automation platforms, and none of them were very good. And we thought that if we could focus on one vertical, we could start standing out as good for somebody, right? And we could let all these other companies try to just continue to be good for everybody, which is like a really, really difficult game to play in the beginning. And so I would say that was like the biggest switch we kind of ever made was we like gathered the whole team together and I was like, hey, like, I really think we should just focus on e-commerce. Here's the reasons. And I think if our goal can be, anytime an e-commerce businesses wants to use this type of technology, we are the obvious choice and there would never be anyone else they would use because everybody else is general. That was like, the whole team got behind it. And ever since we did that, growth has just skyrocketed. Revenue has skyrocketed. We've become like a very well-known name and continuing to build up our brand within, like things like the Shopify ecosystem. And I think that was like the most amazing move we've made as a company.
Sure. To step back just a little bit and take more of a bird's eye view of your approach to competition, how would you define your overall philosophy? Are you trying to position yourself so you're not directly competing with anyone, or are you focused more on making your product the best it can be? So even if another product is similar, yours is better?
Yeah. So once we've picked that vertical, which for us was e-commerce, let's do everything in our power to make the best product possible for this vertical. And everything we always do is in the best interest of e-commerce businesses. So is this feature going to be good for them? Is it not going to be good for them? If it is good for them, we're going to build it.
Do you see competitors doing things that are not good for e-commerce?
So I think there's two categories, right? There's the category that's general, and then there's the category where they are also focused on e-commerce. I think in the general category, I've seen them kind of move around a lot to figure out what is their focus, because they have so many different types of customers or agencies that are using them. They have to build more generalized features and rely on their customers to figure out how to apply those to specific brands, which I think is more difficult. Whereas what we've seen in the e-commerce space, anyone else that's doing kind of e-commerce plus messaging, they've actually started to copy us a lot, which is something that started to happen over the past 6 months. So we'll come out with something because, we're kind of looking ahead. We're looking at what are these bigger companies doing? We're talking to our customers all the time. We're trying to figure out with them, like, how do we make this as good as possible for e-commerce? How do we make it as good as possible for, both the brand and, their customers as well? And I think the fact that these other startups have started to copy us is great, because it means that, we're not focused on them at all. We don't care what they build, and all they're doing is focused on us, which goes totally against what our philosophy is, because they should probably not be paying attention to us. They should be paying attention to these bigger companies, and that's something that could, allow them to propel themselves farther. But right now, if they're copying us, they're basically limited by our innovation, which is pretty great.
Because imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. They say.
But it's also like, imitation is like the most limiting thing they could ever do too, right? Like if we're reaching for the stars and they're reaching for us, they're like the chances that they would surpass us in any meaningful way is tough. It's like not very likely.
So they're flattering you and limiting themselves, which is a win-win for you, it sounds like.
Yeah, and it's also like not something that we think about or like try to look out for. Like we're not like constantly reading, their blog or like trying to follow them or anything, because for us it's like a waste of time. The only time it'll come up is like, if somebody's like a customer's talking to us and they're like, oh, hey, like, yeah, we're gonna start using you. Like we were looking at this other company, but like, it looks like they're farther behind and like they've started to add some of the stuff that you have, but like you have everything and it looks like you're building really fast. So that's usually how we hear about this stuff. And, who better to hear this intel from than customers who are, deciding to go with you.
Yeah, that's great. Is that approach to competition in which you're not paying attention to startups who are copying you, is that an approach that your team agreed on immediately? Is this a conversation that you had to have over time? How did you get everyone on board with how you approach competition?
Yeah, so it's definitely ingrained in the company. I think it's pretty easy for someone, if they like just started, to be like, oh my God, like this other company just like launched this thing that we have. But we're kind of just like, we don't focus on it, right? And so like if it does come up once in a while, it's just not something that we'll dwell on. Whereas I could see like in the reverse scenario, everyone's like, oh my God, like I can't believe they're copying us. Like this is crazy. Like what are they doing? Like what are they going to copy next? Like I can't believe they would do this. And so we definitely like, we don't do that. We don't want to do that. We don't encourage that. Cause it's just like, what are you going to like, what's the end goal of like worrying about that or like trying to figure that out? Like where do you end up with that? Like there's no value in reacting like that. And it's like stressful, which is like, why would you ever want to be stressed about any of this stuff? Like if they're going to copy us, whatever, that's great. They're just focused on us. They can look at our back. That's fine. And we'll just keep moving forward. And so it comes up maybe once in a while if someone had just joined the team, but it doesn't really come up again. We don't really pay any attention to it really.
And that sounds like that's an approach that's worked pretty well for you so far.
Yeah, and I think we're just trying to, lean into that approach even more, and continuously just like look higher and higher at like, what are things that these bigger successful companies that have obviously like moved from the stage we're at to the stage they're at, and like what are some of the things that they did that got, allowed them to do that. And like those are the same types of things that maybe if we're not going to exactly copy them, we can at least see the framework that, or like why they approach that, or like why they did it that way, and figure out how we can apply that to ourselves and our market and our product in a way that makes sense. I think if we were just looking at what, our competitors that were like a similar size are doing, like, it just seems so limiting. Like, we're never going to be able, like, unless they're picking all the greatest things, which, like, I definitely don't want to rely on these people to pick the greatest things. It's just not like a good strategy.
You talked about how you're looking higher and higher. What do you see as the future for Octane in relation to your competition and the market that you're in?
There's so much to do in that space that's just beyond sending you a message when you do something on the store. There's building a relationship. There's understanding your preferences. There's building a rapport. I think long term, like, what we're trying to enable brands to do is build as close to like a true relationship with a customer as they can. And we're helping them do that by reducing the amount of time it takes to have a back and forth.
Well, it sounds like you're working your way there pretty steadily.
The thing we did is we really focused on community and content, and also combining those two things. And so we created a publication called Chatbots Magazine, where anybody who was interested in writing about bots could write there. And so a lot of these people, maybe they're working on their own bot, they have a lot of thoughts on bots, they can't necessarily get published in maybe the biggest publications that are out there, but we can give them a home where they can be published. And so by building out Chatbots Magazine, us creating our own content around that, and then enabling anyone who wanted to write there, now we have over 1,000 people who write for Chatbots Magazine, over 300,000 people read articles on there every day, and it's all completely community driven. And that's something that, one, we just get to see a lot of information out there, but also we just, we can link to Octane AI from any of these pages. It really sets us apart. It really sets us up as market leaders because not only do we have Octane AI, but we're also the owners of the largest publication in the space. And following the success of Chatbots Magazine, we also created Ecommerce Magazine, which basically the same idea, which is let's also become the experts at e-commerce in general, and enable anyone who wants to write about great e-commerce content. But the side effect is that we get to meet all of these amazing people, and then we get to loop in Octane AI really subtly as part of that conversation. So anybody who's trying to kind of break into a market, like, a key thing that you can do that your competitors probably aren't doing is really focusing on community and content. And if you can set it up so that it's really beneficial for everybody involved, whether it's you, the writer, or the reader, it can be really, really valuable.
As someone who works on the content side and producing this podcast, I definitely like the sound of that.
Speaking of which, yes.
Yeah. Exactly. Get that in there. Where can people find Chatbot Magazine and Ecommerce Magazine if they're interested?
So if you go to Google, we're very proud of our SEO. This is like another benefit, and you just search for Ecommerce Magazine. It'll pop up there. You can also search for things like e-commerce agencies or top e-commerce events, and Ecommerce Magazine will also pop up. For Chatbots Magazine, you can go to chatbotsmagazine.com. But also, if you just Google for chatbots or basically anything related to chatbots, probably most of the first page will be filled up with Chatbots Magazine articles.
And if people want to learn more about Octane, where should they find you?
Go to octaneai.com. So that's OCTANEAI.com. And if you have a Shopify store, you can sign up in basically a minute, and you can start earning more revenue by communicating with your customers over these messaging channels. If you want to learn more about, like, at a high level what we're doing and what is messenger marketing and what does the future of this look like and how can you use AI for sales and support, if you go to the resources tab on octaneai.com and you go to our masterclass, we have a bunch of educational videos that we've created that can hopefully blow your mind.
That's great. Sounds like you're working pretty hard to establish yourselves as a voice in the industry, which definitely helps set you apart from your competition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why we got to come on as many podcasts as we can.
All right. We'll have to get you back on here soon. Thank you so much. Really appreciate talking to you.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me.
And thus concludes the Startup Playbook series. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you've enjoyed this Startup Playbook series, or if you're a fan of the All Turtles podcast in general, it would help us out a lot if you're able to leave us a review on iTunes. We really appreciate reviews because they help other people find our show. And good reviews make us feel good. This episode is a production of the All Turtles worldwide media empire. We've recorded this episode in Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, send us an email at hello@all-turtles.com. I read every message. This episode was produced by me, Marie McCoy Thompson. Thanks to Jim Metzendorf for editing this episode, Chris Plug for his audio expertise, Ali Packard for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Matt Schlicht, Octane AI, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.